Hey, Lurkers, miss me yet? While I've been on this break, I haven't really been taking a break from the podcast exactly. I have been working on setting up notes, and I'm getting ready to record at least 7 episodes, possibly 8. I'm working on some notes for a couple more, so that I will be well ahead of the game, and I won't be so stressed and playing catch-up all the time. So that's what I've been doing podcast-wise, is a lot of research. For today, for Thanksgiving, and happy Thanksgiving to those of you who celebrate, and for those who don't, happy Thursday. But I wanted to bring you an old episode. I wanted to do a replay of the Duffy's Cut episode. It had a little bit of a basis in Thanksgiving, and that's kind of how Duffy's Cut came to be discovered, so to speak. I don't want to give too much away. You can listen to it here in this episode. It's a little bit of a 1800s true crime mystery and ghost story. Anyway, I hope you all are enjoying your day, and I will talk to you later.
I fear not the dark itself, but what may lurk within it. Welcome to Lurk, bringing you creepy, strange, and bone-chilling stories, with your host, Jamie Jackson.
Hey Lurkers, welcome to episode 34. I hope all of you who celebrate Thanksgiving had an enjoyable one, and anyone who might be out and about doing any Black Friday shopping, I hope you're finding great deals and having a great time. And in this season of being thankful, I want to let you know how very thankful I am for all of you loyal Lurkers. Our download numbers consistently keep increasing, and that's because of all of you. So thank you, truly. I hope you keep listening. Share it with your friends, share it with your enemies, share it with whoever. Today's episode is going to be a little bit different than our typical episodes. And it's probably going to be a little bit shorter than normal. Just a heads up, between now and Christmas, some of the episodes might be a little bit shorter. I do fully intend to do episodes every Friday per usual. They just might not be as long as normal. Today's episode, as I said, is a little bit different. I came across this topic completely by chance. Because of the Thanksgiving holiday, I was searching around for topic ideas that might coincide with Thanksgiving. And one of the searches I did was for Thanksgiving ghost stories, and the topic of Duffy's Cut popped up. I had never heard of Duffy's Cut, even though it's located only about 2 hours away from my current location. And now that I've learned about it, I am completely fascinated by it. In my research, I read the book Massacre at Duffy's Cut, Tragedy and Conspiracy on the Pennsylvania Railroad by William E. Watson and J. Francis Watson. And the Watsons are central to this whole story, as you'll learn here shortly. I also watched a documentary called Death on the Railroad, and I read many different newspaper articles. I'll make sure to post links in the show notes for you for all of the things that I can post links for. There might be a little bit jumping around in the telling of the story. There's no real easy way to really get the story out without hopping around a bit. The story of Duffy's Cut is a little bit of a ghost story, and it's a little bit of a true crime story. In fact, I'm going to actually share the ghost story part of things first, which is a little different than how I typically do things, but that's really how this whole story starts. Each Thanksgiving growing up, twins Frank and Bill Watson, the gentleman who wrote the book I mentioned, were entertained by their grandfather's stories of working on the Pennsylvania Railroad. Their grandfather, Joseph Trypishin, shared with them the story of the ghost that had been seen in the area known as Duffy's Cut. It said that the ghost of Irishmen who had died while building the Philadelphia to Pittsburgh main line rose to dance in the area of their mass grave. The spirits' forms appeared as blue-green fire, and they hopped across the ground to some unheard Irish music. Here is the actual story from the official railroad file. I'm going to read this. Now, I only have photos of these, so it's not the clearest, so I will try to read this smoothly, but my apologies as I try to make out exactly what the writing says here. The legend about Duffy's Cut on the Pennsylvania Railroad between Malvern and Fraser by Julian F. Saxa, I believe is the last name. On a bright June afternoon, the writer made another visit to the old resident. He of the Hickory Club of years ago, when we first met on our trip to old Susie Evans' ship in Westmoreland. Favored by fortune, the old resident was found at home and extended a hearty greeting. The searcher for historical cobwebs had no hesitation in taking a seat in the proffered rocker on the porch, where Miranda soon joined her husband in making the stranger welcome. After the usual greetings were over, the old man commenced on the visitor's favorite topic with, "Well, mister, Miranda and me both read what you said about fawn stocks. You were right. When I was young, I knew the house well, but it wasn't for the likes of me. It was a gentleman's house, the quality house we used to call it, and, as I told you, Susie Evans and the Paoli were my houses, but I remember it well, and you can believe me if I tell you that Fahnestock's whiskey wasn't a bit better than Susie Evans's. I also mind when old Charlie died, and how his son was down on whiskey, and chopped down his apple orchard. But they are all gone now, all except Casper's wife, who is still alive. There is one thing I mind which you hain't got onto, so Miranda says to me to be sure and tell you when I saw you. It's strange, mister, but I tell it's the truth what I'm going to tell you. Every word of it. Do you believe in ghosts, mister? No? Well, don't laugh at what I am telling you, for what I say is true. I hadn't any whiskey neither, and if you feel like walking, I can take you to the very spot and show you the place. You recollect what I told you about the cholera breaking out in 1832. Well, it was on a warm, murky night in September. I was down to the Green Tree and started to walk home on the railroad. Well, when I came to Duffy's Fill, what's that? Why, it was the bank made over the deep gully just above Malvern, and we all called it Duffy's Fill, while on each side where the hill was grubbed away was called Duffy's Cut. Duffy was the contractor's name. Well, as I was saying, the night was hot and foggy, so I trudged up between the stone blocks until I got on the Fill, and there I saw with my own eyes the ghost of the Irishman who had died with the cholera a month ago, a-dancing around the big trench where they were buried. It's true, mister, it was awful. They looked as if they were a kind of green and blue fire, and there they were, a-hopping and bopping on their graves. Scared? Well, I should say I was. I had heard the Irishmen were a hauntin' the place, because they were buried without the benefit of the clergy, as they said, but I didn't believe it. Well, mister, I was too scared to run, and there I stood a-knocking my knees together, and the ghost advancing and groaning all the time. Well, mister, at last I fell down. I don't know how long I lay there, but when I came to, the ghosts were all gone. I run back to the road what led to the pike. I couldn't go fast, neither. My legs wouldn't go. Mister, I never took that short cut again. Never, no, not till now. And I have heard that more than one track walker has seen things in that hollow. But when anyone goes to tell what they saw, why, people always say he was drunk. But, mister, I know what I told you was so, and I hadn't been drinking no whiskey either, that night. After the old resident was through with his ghostly tale, the writer ventured the suggestion that what he had seen on the murky night was what is known as the ignis fatuus, caused by so many of the cholera victims being buried together without a sufficient covering of earth. Further, that the phenomena was frequently observed on the battlefields during the late rebellion. Nothing, however, could move the old resident from his belief that what he had seen were the disembodied spirits of the laborers who were buried in the trench. So that is the actual account that is in a Pennsylvania Railroad file. It was a file that the Watsons' grandfather had possession of, and this was the story that he told them each year at Thanksgiving. So they grew up hearing this story. To clarify, the Ignis Fatuus is actually the will-o'-the-wisp, which is a bluish glow that is usually seen in like swampy areas, and it's supposed to be caused by decomposing matter. The area of the fill, to my knowledge, is not a swampy area, though I imagine if you have a mass grave, perhaps the decomposing gases could create a will-o'-the-wisp. Many years later, this story was in 1832. The gentleman saw these ghosts about a month after people were supposed to have died from cholera and have been buried in a grave. Years later, the summer of 2000, Bill Watson and a friend, Tom Connor, are at Immaculata University. Bill is a professor of history at the college. And he and his friend are sitting there, and his friend looks out the window, and he draws Bill's attention to something out on the lawn, not too far away. So the two men look out the window, and they both see 3 glowing figures standing close to the building. Bill Watson said, "It looked like neon lights in the shape of men. I thought it was something to do with an art show. We went outside to the lawn to see them, but they were gone. Nothing was there that could have caused it. It was a Hollywood-type special effects. I've never seen anything before or since like that." Then, in 2002, Bill Watson comes across a railroad file that his brother Frank had inherited from their grandfather about 20 years before. The file contained information on an area called Duffy's Cut, and the first document in the file was the 1832 ghost story account, the one that I read you. Bill Watson was shocked at both the close proximity of the area of Duffy's Cut to the university where he worked, which is only about a couple miles, and by the similarity between what he had seen that night on campus and the description of the apparitions in the file. Hang on, we'll be right back after this quick message.
We know you've got a great story to tell. Your Best True Story is a new podcast that wants you to tell your most amazing, most unbelievable, most incredible true story for a chance to win cash and worldwide fame. All story types are considered, and all you have to do is record it over your phone. It can be a hilarious drunk story, a thrilling survival tale, a creepy true ghost story, or anything else. If the audience loves it, you win. Go to yourbesttruestory.com to learn more and subscribe to the Your Best True Story podcast right now. Your Best True Story, where you're the story.
Which would be the blue-green fire-like Irishman ghosts. The two brothers began to wonder if there might be some truth behind the stories, and so began their quest to find out the truth. But we're going to start at the beginning here. So, like I said, we're going to hop around a little bit. Now we're going to backtrack to 1832. April of 1832, in fact, when a ship called the John Stamp left the port in Derry, Ireland, heading to Philadelphia, with about 100 Irish immigrants on board. Times were hard then in Ireland, and they were leaving behind poverty and religious strife, heading to America with the hope of attaining that American dream. The John Stamp finally arrives in the Philadelphia port June 23, 1832, but not after first stopping at what was the first quarantine hospital in the country, the Lazaretto in Delaware County. At the time, cholera was raging around the world, and as a precaution, a doctor would have boarded the ship to make sure all the passengers were healthy and showing no signs of illness before being allowed to continue on to Philadelphia. If anyone was found to be sick, they would have been taken off the ship. But no one on the John Stamp had cholera. Everyone was cleared, and the ship continued on to dock near the Washington Avenue Immigration Station, which is at Pier 53. But before we get into too much of the story of the Irish immigrants from the John Stamp, I need to tell you about Patrick Duffy, because he's the person Duffy's Cut is named for. Patrick Duffy was born in Ireland himself, and came to America at the age of 15. He became a U.S. citizen at the age of 30. He was an employee of the Pennsylvania Railroad and given the contract for Mile 59. Mile 59 was the most expensive and the most difficult and dangerous mile of the entire 82-mile system, and it became known as Duffy's Cut. It was the most difficult mile because the Canal Commission decided to make a 300-foot-long earthen fill at the site instead of the more expensive stone bridge option. Fill made of rocks and soil that had been taken from the cut had to be hauled by cart and dumped where the earth bridge was going to be located. The work was so backbreaking and brutal that slave owners would not allow their slaves to participate. At the time, Irish Catholics were considered the lowest of the low on the socioeconomic totem pole, and they were willing to do the work out of desperation. Part of my family would have been included in these lowest of the low in the socioeconomic totem pole. My Irish grandmother that I mentioned in the very beginning of the Lep Castle episode last week was born in Ireland. Her whole family came here. She came over here with her parents and her siblings. Not in 1832. Much later. I'm not that old. But yeah, the Irish immigrants were actually treated extremely poorly back in the day. Patrick Duffy was known to hire Irish immigrants to do the backbreaking work. Most likely he played off his own Irish background to convince them to come to work for him. But even though he was a fellow Irishman, Duffy treated the Irish Catholics as expendable, and these men were the ones who were typically killed in the course of their jobs. So Mile 59, or Duffy's Cut, was supposed to be finished by April 1832, but the difficulties slowed down the progress, and in June of 1832, Patrick Duffy needed to hire more men to try to get Mile 59 completed. So Patrick Duffy makes his way down to the port to find a new crew, and he ends up hiring 57 Irish immigrants off the John Stamp. The 57 immigrants were set up in an encampment near the cut, which was nothing more than a shantytown. The summer heat was intense that July and August. It was apparently record heat at the time, and those workers most likely drank from nearby streams to stay hydrated. And that's when the cholera struck. Cholera is an acute diarrheal infection that is caused by the ingestion of contaminated food or water. It causes severe acute watery diarrhea. Most people never develop symptoms, and those with symptoms usually end up with mild or moderate symptoms. Only about 30 to 40% of people who get cholera die. Cholera was a source of mass hysteria in the 1830s. Back then, no one knew what the cause was. Well, they didn't know what the real cause was because they figured it must be the Irish Catholic immigrants that brought it to their town. However, it's most likely the fact that people didn't know about bacteria and contaminants and drinking water. And so they would have outhouses near leach field, leaching into streams, and you would drink from the streams and you would get that contaminated, and that's really how this all started. Also, if you remember, these immigrants have all been checked out already in the quarantine hospital. None of them were sick. None of them had cholera. They were all allowed to continue to the port because they were healthy. So anyway, these 57 Irish immigrant workers at Duffy's Cut end up with cholera. They were all quarantined in the shanty town. A few tried to seek out help from nearby farms, but they were all turned away. The Gazette mentioned one of Duffy's Cut workers managed to flee to another immigrant worker's site at Mile 48, which is about 11 miles from Duffy's Cut. By August of 1832, all 57 of the Irish immigrants hired off of the John Stamp were dead. During their quarantine, it was reported that only a blacksmith, possibly named Malachi Harris, and 4 nuns from the Sisters of Charity Cholera Hospital in Philadelphia tended the ill and buried them when they died. The fear of cholera forced the 4 nuns to be shunned, and they were forced to walk back to their hospital in Philadelphia. Patrick Duffy ordered the shantytown burned. The bodies were all allegedly buried in a mass grave. The following account was written by Julian Saxa in 1889 for the Village Record. In the month of August, the much-dreaded cholera suddenly made its appearance among the laborers. Many were stricken, causing great consternation, and with the improper attention and lack of proper remedies, the scourge could not but rage with terrible effect. Most of the workmen fled from the infected shanty at once, but so great was the fear of the surrounding population that every house was closed against the fugitives. No one was found willing to give them food and shelter. When it was known that a case had resulted fatally, fear changed to panic. The fatal spot was avoided. With a single exception, no one was left to minister to the wants of the sick or bury the dead. This exception was the blacksmith of the contractor, who had his shop near the shanty. This hero, whose name is unfortunately lost to history, is said to have been an American, born and bred in Chester County, and when all fled, he alone remained and ministered to the sick. And when the scourge claimed its first victim, he blew his dinner horn for assistance. None coming. He laid the man out, and as decently as he could, dug a grave single-handed, where the enclosure is now, then returned and dragged the corpse over to the opposite side of the ravine and buried it. At the outbreak of the epidemic, word had been sent to the city of the sad state of affairs. In response, the church authorities at once sent out several sisters of charity to attend to the sick and dying in the shanty in the ravine. An eyewitness yet remembers the sensation caused by the arrival of the stage at the Green Tree, with its precious freight. This was as near the infected spot as the driver could be induced to go. How these 4 brave women, clad in the habit of their order, in the hot blazing August sun, started cheerfully to walk up the turnpike, carrying large parcels of supplies and medicines, was a sight not to be forgotten, even after this long elapse of years. On the arrival of these angels of mercy at the shanty, they found all the sick, with the exception of the brave blacksmith, who at first tried to dissuade them from their mission, but was soon convinced that the new arrivals had come to stay and do their duty, fearless of the result to themselves. However, notwithstanding their merciful efforts, all the victims fell a victim to the scourge. No sooner did one succumb to the fell destroyer than the brave smith would arrange him as best he could, place the body on the sled, and drag it across the ravine and bury it beside the others, where as soon as he knew that all would die, he dug a ditch to receive them. The day after the last man died, the 4 Sisters of Mercy attempted to return to the city, but so great was the fear of contagion that they could not get neither shelter nor conveyance, and tradition tells us that although jaded and worn out as they were by their vigils and duty to the dying laborers, they were forced to walk all the way to the city, 20 miles, according to the milestones. But to these 4 weak females, frail in body but strong in spirit, it seemed more like 200. It is stated that at the sight of their habit, doors would be closed and all assistance refused to these persons, who had themselves risked their own lives to save that of their unknown fellow men. The tradition further says that although the day was burning hot and the poor creatures almost famished, they could not even get a drop of water, until they arrived at the Spring House Tavern below the 16th milestone, where the cooling spring crosses the turnpike, and where they could not be prevented from slaking their burning thirst. They finally arrived at the city long after the shades of night had fallen, starved and famished, but undismayed, and ready to start again on their errands of mercy, wherever called. The contractor no sooner heard that all were dead than he sent word to the heroic blacksmith to set fire to all the buildings and utensils on the ground, which was done. So the Watson brothers, Bill and Frank, decide to try and find the mass grave. If you remember in that brief little reading, the blacksmith noted that he dragged them all across, buried them in the fill, and because they were dying so fast, he ended up just digging one trench to put all of them in at once. Bill and Frank Watson begin combing through their grandfather's Pennsylvania Railroad file and researching the story of the death of the men at Duffy's Cut, and they start noticing some discrepancies. I mean, the fact that there's a ghost story as part of an official secret railroad company file is a strange discrepancy, but there were a couple other things as well. There was an article that appeared in the Village Record, November 7th, 1832, that was published as an update to an earlier article in the same paper on October 3rd. but there's no record of the earlier article. The lack of any records means that it may have been pulled from the record at or close to its publication date. I'm going to read the November 7th article. As faithful chroniclers, and to prevent exaggeration, we deem it proper to state that on the railway in East Whiteland Township, a fortnight ago, several cases of cholera occurred, 8 of which proved fatal. It then ceased suddenly as it commenced. One man, from there, moved up to the Valley Creek, near the line of East Bradford and East Calne, where he died. One other person also died immediately afterwards. A humane man, a smith by trade, remained as nurse, while all the other workmen fled. Having shaved and decently laid out the second man who died, he blew his horn and called in some neighbors, who aided to bury him. The contractor, after a day or two, set fire to the shanties and burned them down. The disease extended no farther. The humane smith is hardy. All along the line we learn it now is and has been through the summer. So in this story, they say only 8 men died and that the blacksmith received help to bury them. There were 57 men in that Irish immigrant shanty town working at Duffy's Cut. And yet they're only reporting that 8 have been buried and have died. Another interesting point to be made is that on the worst day of the cholera epidemic in Philadelphia, there were 176 cases with 71 deaths. A 100% mortality rate for several cases is unlikely. 100% mortality rate for 57 cases is impossible. It also appeared that the railroad was trying to keep information about what happened at Duffy's Cut quiet. There was a memo in the file that mentioned this. We have located an old file in the supervisor's office at Downingtown in regard to Duffy's Cut, and Mr. Clement has suggested that you bring Mr. Houston, I think that is his name, in to see this file, as it is not desired to let it get out of the office. So finally, the Watsons had enough information to be able to go forward with physically searching for the mass grave. They assembled a team that consisted of historians, a geophysicist, a forensic dentist, anthropologist, and the Chester County Deputy Coroner. November 2005, they began finding some evidence that included clay pipes. In March of 2009, they finally found what they had been looking for: a tibia, skull fragments, and more than 80 other bones. Over the next 2 years, they uncovered 6 more sets of remains, and eventually a 7th was found under a poplar tree, making the total 8 bodies found. But the story isn't over. I did say this was a little bit of a true crime story, and we haven't quite gotten there yet, but we're getting ready to now. When the skulls were examined by anthropologist Janet Monge, there was evidence of blunt force trauma happening at or near the time of death. In case you're not sure what that means, it means they were murdered. Cholera doesn't cause blunt force trauma, just in case you were wondering. In addition to the blunt force trauma, one of the skeletons that was much taller than the others showed signs of a bullet hole and trauma from an axe blow. Anthropologist Dr. Janet Monge of the University of Pennsylvania did scans of the skull and confirmed remnants of a lead bullet inside the skull cavity. They also determined one of the 8 bodies belonged to a woman. So what happened? It's speculated that these 8 immigrants attempted to flee the shanty town, and when they did, a local vigilante group killed them to prevent the spread of cholera. At the time, there was a vigilante group called the East Whiteland Horse Company. They typically took care of horse thieves and retrieving stolen horses, but they also worked in the capacity of a legal vigilante group working with a local judge. The East Whiteland Horse Company was dominated by the Pratt family, who also, coincidentally, owned property there at Mile 59, and Mile 59 is also Duffy's Cut. Dr. Janet Monge said in an interview, "I would have to say it was actually a massacre. They all showed signs essentially of wounds. The preponderance of evidence is that they met a violent death. We have evidence of blunt force trauma, evidence of sharp force trauma, and we have evidence of bullet holes. It's likely some of the workers did die of cholera, but it's equally likely that other workers died from violence as well. The murdered 8 were brought back in coffins sealed with 80 to 100 nails and buried in the fill. Burying dead workers in the fill became the general practice after Duffy's cut. The East Whiteland Horse Company did all they could to hide what happened, including, most likely, confiscating all copies of that October 3, 1832 Village Record article that allegedly told the whole story. The correction piece was put in place to hide the details, including listing a smaller number and having no mention of murder. Since being discovered, 2 sets of remains have been returned to their native Ireland. John Ruddy was an 18-year-old and the first to be identified because of an unusual and rare genetic dental anomaly. I actually believe they had been discussing it on a radio program, and somehow the information got to relatives of John Ruddy, and they were able to determine that's definitely who he was because of that. The other remains that ended up going back to Ireland were the remains of the woman that had been identified as Catherine Burns, a 30-year-old widow. The rest of the remains were interred at the West Laurel Hill Cemetery, and a large Celtic cross and monument is there with all the names of all the victims from 1832 as a memorial. Did Duffy know the truth of what happened? Most likely he did, and he helped to cover it up. And interestingly, no one spoke of what happened until after Patrick Duffy's death in 1871. And he also reported that all 57 died of cholera, when clearly they did not. So that's it, right? Wrong. Remember I mentioned that there was one man who escaped to another immigrant work camp 11 miles away at mile 48 near Downingtown. Well, now the team that discovered the truth about Duffy's cut has begun uncovering another mass burial. It seems that the man that escaped ended up with another crew, and in this crew, again, there was an outbreak of cholera, and the entire crew of Irish immigrants all died at once. They were buried in a mass grave in an area that has now become a cemetery, though the area where the mass grave is reported to be has never been used for any other burials. The Duffy's Cut team has received permission to excavate the area to look for and hopefully find the graves, and they're planning to look for evidence of violence on any remains uncovered, because as I mentioned, having 100% of people with cholera die in a small number is impossible. That's not me saying that. That's the math, statistics, and how cholera works. So, yes, a couple could die, but having everybody wiped out would not happen. So if all of these men from this other area, mile 48, also all died, then based on what happened at Duffy's Cut, it is incredibly reasonable and probable that some of them may have been helped along. Interestingly, this area where Duffy's Cut is located is referred to as the Dark Valley by the Lenni Lenape tribe who used to live in the area. There are still ghost sightings in the area of Duffy's Cut. Others have seen odd lights in the woods there. Some residents say they have seen lantern lights as well. And at the Immaculata University, where the artifacts from the excavation are displayed, it's said that there are some strange occurrences that are associated with the items. Remember the ship the John Stamp that brought those 57 men to America? Well, on February 17th, 1839, it was fully rigged and carrying a cargo of raw cotton from Bombay, India, to Liverpool, England, when it sank in a storm and 7 crew were lost. You can't visit this area. The property where the bodies were found is owned by Amtrak, and you cannot go down there to visit it. If you take the train, you can see it. There is a small stone fence that was put where the majority of the bodies are buried, and there's a metal sign hanging above it indicating what it is. And I believe you can see that from the train as you go by. I am in the show notes going to post a link to the Facebook page for the Duffy's Cut Project. I have followed them because I am excited to see what happens in their Downingtown excavation. I'm hoping to have a chance to get out there to visit the memorial that they have for the 57 men. A very sad part of American history. It would be really cool to be able to drive by the area at night and maybe see some blue-green, flaming, Irish, dancing ghost hopping about. And on that note, I want to include this one last comment from Bill Watson that says, "None of this would have happened if I hadn't seen those figures standing on the campus lawn." And that's going to do it for this episode, which basically was the discovery of mass murder thanks to the ghosts of the victims. Not your typical episode, not your typical story, but one I'm going to guess that most of you have never heard before. Unless maybe you're a native from Pennsylvania. But even then, I don't know that you would know it. Speaking of ghost stories, we are asking our listeners to share their own personal paranormal stories with us, possibly to be included in our Christmas Eve episode. So please email them to lurkpodcast@yahoo.com or send us a message through one of our social media platforms. And make sure you send those to us by December 17th. We would love to bring back the old tradition of telling ghost stories on Christmas. Not as crazy as it sounds, it actually was a tradition that happened a long time ago. And to be honest with you, telling ghost stories at every family gathering, including Christmas, is something that my family did. And I can remember back when I was like 4. Some of the stories were made up. Some of them were not truthful. My aunt liked to tell all kinds of crazy stories. But a lot of them were actual stories of paranormal experiences. My dad has one, and I'm hoping I can convince him to share that with me this Thanksgiving so I can write down all the details and include that. So please, I really would love to get some stories other than from my immediate family to include in this, and then our Christmas Eve episode will be sharing these stories with everybody. As always, you can find our podcast wherever you listen to your favorite podcast or at lurkpodcast.com. And on the website, you can find links to all of our social media platforms where you can like or follow us on those and send us a message telling us your ghost stories. And we also have merch available at lurkpodcastmerch.com. Grab some Lurk merch for your loved ones for Christmas. We even have baby, toddler, and kid sizes, so your entire family can be decked out in Lurk logo merchandise. I know that's what my son's getting. So until next time, keep lurking.